The amber lights of the Nexus Prime Cantina flickered through thick clouds of exotic smoke. The air was heavy with the scent of burning Altarian spice and the metallic tang of recycled atmosphere. Creatures from across the galaxy crowded around. Small tables, their voices creating a constant buzz of different languages and dialects. In one corner, away from the main crowd, sat a table that commanded respect. Other patrons gave it a wide berth, occasionally stealing glances at the scarred figure hunched over a glass of glowing blue liquid. Kethmal was a living legend among the veterans of the Terran Wars. His 4 muscular arms were covered in ritual, scars that told the story of every battle he had survived. His crystalline exoskeleton, once gleaming silver, now bore the dull patina of age and combat damage. Around him sat a group of young aliens who had never seen real war. They wore fresh uniforms and carried themselves with the swagger of those who had only fought simulations. Tonight, they had cornered the old veteran, hoping to hear tales of glory and easy victories. Thyrix, a young mantoid fresh from the academy, leaned back in his chair with obvious arrogance. His green carapace caught the light as he gestured dismissively with his blade-like arms. "I still don't understand why everyone makes such a big deal about the human wars," he said, his voice carrying across the table. "From what I've read in the Academy files, they were just another primitive species that got lucky." A few other young recruits nodded in agreement. Zist, a small Velkari with large black eyes, added, "Their technology was centuries behind ours. They couldn't even survive in space without clunky life support systems." Kethmal had been quietly nursing his drink, but now his 4 hands tightened around the glass. The liquid inside began to glow brighter, responding to the heat from his palms. When he finally looked up, his compound eyes reflected the cantina lights like broken mirrors. "Humans," he said slowly, his voice cutting through the younger alien's chatter. "You think you know about humans?" The table fell silent. Even the conversations at nearby tables seemed to quiet down as other patrons sensed the shift in atmosphere. Kethmal was known throughout Nexus Prime as someone you didn't want to anger. Thyrix, either too young or too stupid to recognize the danger, pressed on. "Come on, old-timer. Everyone knows the stories get exaggerated over time. They were soft-skinned. Weaklings who couldn't even breathe standard atmosphere without mechanical help. How dangerous could they really be?" The glass in Kethmal's hands began to crack under the pressure. Blue liquid seeped between his fingers as he slowly stood up. His full height was impressive, even by Zephyrian standards. The scars on his arms seemed to pulse with their own light. "Sit down, young one," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made the entire cantina fall silent. "Let me tell you about the day the galaxy learned to fear the sound of human footsteps." Every eye in the cantina was now focused on their table. The bartender, a massive Thorogian with 6 arms, stopped cleaning glasses. Even the automated service drones seemed to pause in their duties. Kethmal's reputation as one of the few survivors of the First Contact War preceded him wherever he went. The old veteran slowly sat back down, never taking his eyes off Thyrix. "You want to know about humans? Fine. But don't interrupt me again, or you'll find out firsthand why I'm one of the few who lived to tell these stories." He signaled the bartender for another drink, then leaned back in his chair. The scars on his arms seemed to tell their own stories in the flickering light. "It was during the 3rd Galactic expansion," Kethmal began, his voice taking on the rhythm of a practiced storyteller. "The Council had just finished cataloguing a new sector near the Galactic Rim. Most of the worlds were empty, but long-range scouts had detected signs of primitive civilization on one small blue planet." He paused as the bartender brought him a fresh drink, this one glowing green instead of blue. Earth, they called it. The intelligence reports were laughable. The dominant species had barely figured out nuclear fusion. Their fastest ships moved slower than our cargo haulers. They still used chemical explosives as weapons. A few of the younger aliens chuckled, but the sound died quickly when Kethmal's gaze swept over them. The Galactic Council decided they would make excellent servants. The plan was simple: offer them protection in exchange for tribute, standard procedure for primitive worlds. They sent their best diplomat, Ambassador Vexcaran, with a full ceremonial fleet to make the offer official. Kethmal, took a long sip of his drink, savoring both the liquid and the attention of his audience. The human ambassador who met with Vexcaran was a small female named Kim Minji. She looked fragile, almost childlike compared to our representatives. The intelligence files said she was some kind of scientist, not even a career diplomat. He set down his glass and fixed Thyrix with a stare that made the young mantoid shift uncomfortably. Vexcaran gave her the standard ultimatum: join the galactic community as a tributary species, accept our protection and guidance, or face the consequences of defying the Council's will. The cantina was so quiet now that the hum of the life support systems seemed loud. Kethmal's voice dropped to almost a whisper, forcing everyone to lean in to hear him. Kim Minji listened to the entire presentation without saying a word. She asked a few technical questions about tribute requirements and protection services. Very professional, very calm. Then she smiled and said something that would change the course of galactic history. "What did she say?" whispered Zist, unable to contain his curiosity. Kethmal's expression grew grim, the scars on his face seeming deeper in the amber light. She said, "Ambassador Vexcaran, we appreciate your offer, but humanity chooses option 3. Thyrix leaned forward despite himself, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine curiosity. What was option 3? The old veteran's laugh was like grinding metal. That's exactly what Vexcaran asked, and Kim Minji's response was the first hint of what we were really dealing with. She said, "Option 3 is the one where we find out what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object." Kethmal finished his drink in one gulp and stood up again. We would find out soon enough what she meant, and those of us who survived that discovery would never be the same again. The cantina remained silent as the implications of his words sank in. Finally, one of the younger aliens found his voice. "What happened next?" Kethmal smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Next came the storm that would shake the foundations of galactic civilization, but that's a story for another round. Jove drinks. The bartender had refilled everyone's drinks, and the cantina had settled into an expectant silence. Kethmal stared into his glass for a long moment, as if seeing ghosts in the swirling liquid. "My first real encounter with human warfare came during the siege of Kepler Station," he began, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The younger aliens had to lean forward to catch every word. "I was just a tactical officer then, barely older than you are now, fresh out of the academy, eager to prove myself in real combat." He paused, running one of his scarred hands along the table's surface. "I was stationed aboard the Hegemony flagship Void Crusher, the pride of our battle fleet. Captain Morthak had hand-picked me for his tactical team. I thought I was the luckiest young officer in the galaxy." Thyrix, despite his earlier bravado, found himself drawn into the story. "What was Kepler Station?" "A human mining outpost in the asteroid belt of some insignificant system," Kethmal replied. "Intelligence reports said it was barely defended. Maybe 1,000 civilians, a handful of security guards, and 8 ships that looked like they belonged in a scrapyard rather than a battlefield." The old veteran's eyes took on a distant look. "We approached with 50 of our finest warships. The Void Crusher alone had enough firepower to level a small moon. Our sensors showed the human vessels were ancient cargo haulers and converted mining ships. Their biggest weapon was probably some kind of industrial laser cutter." He gestured with 2 of his arms, recreating the tactical display he had studied decades ago. "Captain Morthak was in a good mood that day. He thought we'd wrap this up before lunch and be back to base in time for the victory celebration. The plan was simple: surround them, demand surrender, and when they inevitably gave up, we'd process them as prisoners and move on to the next target." Kethmal's laugh was bitter, like metal scraping against stone. "The human commander was a man named Park Hyunwoo. Our intelligence files showed he was just a cargo pilot who had been pressed into military service when the war started. No formal training, no combat experience. He'd spent most of his career hauling raw materials between mining stations." The younger aliens exchanged glances. This sounded like exactly the kind of easy victory they had been expecting to hear about. Captain Morthak opened communications with the human vessels. "Standard procedure: surrender now and we'll make your deaths quick and painless. Resist and we'll take our time." Kethmal's voice grew darker. Park Hyun-woo's response was unexpected. "What did he say?" asked Zist, his large black eyes reflecting the cantina's amber lights. He thanked Captain Morthak for the warning, then said he had a counter-offer. He wanted to know if our ships were rated for asteroid impact. Kethmal shook his head slowly. We thought he was making some kind of joke. Asteroids? What did mining rocks have to do with space combat? The veteran took a long drink before continuing. We moved into attack formation. Standard engagement pattern. Surround the enemy, eliminate their ability to maneuver, then pick them apart one by one. It should have been over in minutes. His voice grew more intense as he relived the battle. The humans waited until we were in close formation, all our ships clustered together for maximum firepower concentration. That's when Park Hyun-woo showed us what real tactical thinking looked like. Kethmal stood up, using his forearms to illustrate the battle formation. They detonated their own cargo ship. Not just any explosion. They had packed it with refined metals and industrial debris, then positioned it perfectly in the center of our formation. When it went off, it created a cloud of metallic particles that completely scrambled our targeting. Systems! The cantina patrons leaned in closer as his voice rose with excitement. Our sensors went blind. Our weapons couldn't lock on. For maybe 30 seconds, our entire fleet was flying in formation, but unable to see anything beyond visual range. In space combat, 30 seconds might as well be 30 years. But that wasn't the clever part, he continued, his eyes gleaming with what might have been admiration. While we were stumbling around like blind cave crawlers, the humans didn't retreat like any sane species would do. They attacked. Thyrix's mandibles clicked nervously. They attacked 50 warships with 7 cargo haulers. 6 cargo haulers, Kethmal corrected. They had just sacrificed one to blind us. But what they did next still gives me nightmares. He sat back down, his voice dropping to an almost hypnotic whisper. A human pilot named Lee So-young was flying one of their fighters, and I use the term fighter loosely. It was basically a mining pod with some weapons bolted on. The old veteran's hands trembled slightly as he continued. She somehow managed to navigate through our defensive grid while our sensors were scrambled. Her ship was already damaged from the debris cloud, leaking atmosphere, probably dying already. Any rational being would have used those final moments to escape. What did she do instead? The question came from somewhere in the crowd of listeners that had gathered around their table. She crashed directly into our command bridge. The words fell like hammer blows in the silent cantina. Not near it, not close to it. She flew that dying ship right through our defensive screens and into the heart of the Void Crusher. The explosion took out our primary command center and killed half the senior staff. Kethmal's voice cracked slightly. She could have ejected. Her escape pod systems were still functional. We confirmed that later when we analyzed the wreckage. But she chose to stay with her ship to ensure maximum damage to our vessel. Thyrix shifted uncomfortably in his seat. She killed herself just to damage one ship. That's when I first realized we were dealing with something unprecedented, Kethmal said grimly. But it was what happened next that truly shook me to my core. While we were dealing with the fighter attack, trying to restore command and control, the humans revealed their real strategy. He paused, letting the tension build. They had been mining that asteroid field for years. They knew every rock, every trajectory, every gravitational pull, and they had been preparing for this moment long before we arrived. The veteran's voice grew distant, as if he was seeing the battle again through younger eyes. Park Hyun-woo's remaining ships spread out through the asteroid field. They weren't trying to run or hide. They were positioning themselves next to the biggest rocks they could find. Then they started using their industrial haulers as improvised mass drivers. Mass drivers? Asked one of the younger aliens. They turned their mining equipment into weapons, Kethmal explained. Those cargo haulers had powerful tractor beams designed to move massive chunks of raw ore. Instead of loading cargo, they started launching asteroids at us. Not small ones, house-sized. Chunks of solid rock and metal, accelerated to incredible speeds. The cantina was completely silent now except for the veteran's voice. Our point defense systems were designed to stop missiles and fighters, not flying mountains. The first asteroid hit the Reaper's edge amidships and cracked her hull like an egg. The second one took out the Star Devourer's engines. Kethmal's laugh was hollow. Captain Morthak was screaming orders, trying to restore some kind of tactical coherence. Our remaining ships were scattered, half-blind, and now dodging chunks of rock the size of small buildings. It was chaos. He took another drink, his hands steadier now. That's when Park Hyun-woo demonstrated why humans are the most dangerous species in the galaxy. His ship, a converted ore hauler called the Lucky Strike, took a direct hit from our main cannon. The entire front section was vaporized. Any other species would have been finished right there. The veteran's voice grew quiet with something that might have been respect. But the humans jury-rigged life support in the cargo hold and kept fighting. For another 6 hours with half a ship. Half a ship. They rerouted power through backup systems that weren't designed to handle that kind of load, sealed hull breaches with whatever materials they could find, and somehow kept their weapons operational. How is that possible? Whispered Zist. Because humans don't know when to quit, Kethmal replied. Park Hyun-woo spent those 6 hours turning his dying ship into the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield. He couldn't maneuver anymore, couldn't run, couldn't even maintain proper life support. So he did the only thing left to do. The old veteran stood up again, his forearms spread wide. He turned his ship into a guided missile, used the last of his fuel to build up speed, aimed straight for the Void Crusher, and rode that dying hulk right into our main reactor. The silence that followed was complete. Even the background hum of the station's life support seemed muted. The explosion lit up half the system, Kethmal said quietly. When the radiation cleared and our survivors regrouped, we had lost 12 ships and over 8,000 crew members. The humans had started with 8 vessels and 1,000 civilians. He sat back down heavily. And that was just the beginning of our education in human warfare. The atmosphere in the cantina had grown heavy with tension. Kethmal's previous stories had been shocking, but the way his voice trembled now suggested something far worse was coming. The veteran's forearms shook as he reached for his drink, and several patrons noticed the way his crystalline exoskeleton seemed to have lost some of its natural glow. What truly terrified us wasn't their weapons or their ships, Kethmal continued, his voice barely steady. Any species can build bigger guns or faster engines given enough time and resources. What made humans different was their complete disregard for what every civilized race in the galaxy considered the natural order of warfare. He traced one scarred finger along a particularly deep mark running across his crystalline chest plate. The wound was old, but it had never properly healed, leaving a permanent crack in his natural armor. I got this during the Battle of Titans, Edge, 3 months after Kepler Station. Command thought they had learned from our mistakes. This time we would be smart about it. Thyrix, who had been unusually quiet since the previous story, finally found his voice. What happened at Titan's Edge? We had received intelligence about a human supply convoy moving through the outer rim, Kethmal explained, his eyes taking on that distant look again. 3 cargo transports and a single escort frigate. Nothing fancy, just civilians trying to resupply one of their outer colonies. Command saw it as the perfect opportunity to cut off their supply lines without risking another major battle. The old veteran paused to take a sip of his drink, but his hands were shaking so badly that some of the liquid spilled onto the table. The plan was foolproof. We would intercept them in open space, far from any support. 37 warships against 4 civilian vessels. Even humans couldn't turn those odds around. One of the younger aliens, a Therodian with bronze scales, leaned forward. But they did, didn't they? The human commander was a young man named Choi Woo-jin, Kethmal continued, ignoring the question. 26 years old, barely out of their military academy. His service record showed he was a supply officer, not even a combat specialist. Intelligence suggested he had been placed in command simply because he was the highest-ranking human in the convoy. The veteran's laugh was bitter and hollow. We gave them the standard ultimatum: surrender your cargo and prepare to be processed as prisoners of war. Simple, clean, by the book. Any rational species would have complied immediately. But humans aren't rational, whispered Zist, the small Velkari who had been hanging on every word. Choi Woo-jin's response was to request a 5-minute delay to prepare his crew for surrender, Kethmal said, his voice growing darker. We granted it, thinking it was just administrative procedure. That 5 minutes was all he needed to implement. The most horrifying battle plan I've ever witnessed. The cantina had grown completely silent now, with even the bartender abandoning his work to lean in and listen. The only sounds were the distant hum of the station's life support systems and the occasional clink of glasses. He turned his transport ships into guided missiles, Kethmal said, each word falling like a hammer blow. But first, he ordered all non-essential personnel to the escape pods. I watched through our tactical displays as dozens of small craft launched from the doomed vessels. Families, children, elderly civilians, all packed into those tiny emergency pods. The veteran's voice cracked slightly as he continued. Any civilized species would have used those pods to flee to safety. That's what they're for. Emergency evacuation when a ship is doomed. But humans loaded them with explosives and turned them into guidance systems for their improvised weapons. Several of the younger aliens gasped in shock. Even in their limited experience, the idea of turning rescue equipment into weapons was unthinkable. The escape pods were small, fast, and almost impossible to track on our sensors, Kethmal explained. They spread out in a wide pattern, each one carrying just enough explosive to damage our ship's hulls. But that wasn't their real purpose. They were forward observers, calling in targeting data for the larger ships. He stood up slowly, his arms recreating the tactical situation. Choi Woo-jin kept his escort frigate in reserve, while his 3 transports built up speed. Those cargo haulers weren't designed for combat maneuvers, but they didn't need to be. They just needed to reach terminal velocity and maintain course. The old veteran's eyes gleamed with what might have been admiration mixed with horror. Our fleet tried to intercept them, but the escape pods were already among us, exploding against our hulls, disrupting our formation. In the confusion, those 3 flying bombs found their targets. The first transport hit the heavy cruiser, Darkness Falls dead center. The explosion was so massive it lit up the entire battlefield. The second one clipped the battleship Iron Throne and sent it spinning out of control. But it was the third, one that really shook us. Kethmal sat back down, his movements slow and deliberate. Choi Woo-jin had stayed aboard his escort frigate, but not to escape. He was coordinating the entire attack, making sure every sacrifice counted for maximum damage. When the transports had completed their runs, he made his own. The veteran's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Our communications specialists had been monitoring their channels, expecting to hear panic, despair, maybe pleas for mercy. Instead, we heard Choi Woo-jin singing. Singing? Thyrix's voice cracked with disbelief. Some kind of human war song, Kethmal confirmed. His voice was calm, almost peaceful, as he guided his ship straight into our flagship. The last thing our communications picked up was him saying, "For Earth, for humanity, for those who come." After us, the silence that followed was so complete that several patrons could be heard breathing heavily. The weight of the story was settling over them like a burial shroud. But that wasn't the worst part, Kethmal continued, his voice barely audible now. The worst part came when our intelligence division analyzed the communications data. The humans had been broadcasting everything on open channels. Every ship, every station, every human settlement in the galaxy was watching their people die, fighting impossible odds. He looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. We expected this to break their spirit. Any sane species would have been demoralized by watching their people die in hopeless battles. Instead, it made them fight harder. Within hours of the Battle of Titan's Edge, human recruitment centers were overwhelmed with volunteers. Civilians were converting their personal ships into weapons. Children were learning to build bombs from household materials. An entire species had watched their heroes die and decided to follow their example. Zis spoke up in a shaky voice that barely carried across the table. "How do you defeat an enemy that doesn't fear death?" Kethmal's laugh was hollow, like wind through empty corridors. "You don't. You pray they don't decide you're worth dying to stop." The veteran traced the scar on his chest plate again, his expression distant. This came from a piece of shrapnel when Choi Woo-jin's ship exploded. I was on the bridge of our command vessel, supposedly safe behind layers of armor and shielding. But the explosion was so powerful that debris punched through everything we had. He stood up again, his movements stiff with old pain. I carry this scar not just as a reminder of that battle, but as a reminder of what humans are capable of when they decide something is worth their lives. Every time I look in the mirror, I see the mark left by a 26-year-old supply officer who turned a hopeless situation into a victory through sheer force of will. The cantina remained silent as Kethmal finished his drink. Finally, one of the younger aliens found the courage to speak. "Did you win the battle?" "We held the field when it was over," Kethmal replied. "But we lost something more important that day. We lost our certainty that superior firepower and numbers would always triumph. From that moment on, every battle with humans became a question of whether we were willing to pay the price they were asking." He looked around the room one more time, his crystalline eyes reflecting the amber lights like broken stars. And the price kept getting higher. The cantina had grown so quiet that the sound of Kethmal refilling his glass seemed to echo through the entire space. His four hands were trembling more noticeably now, and the other patrons could see the weight of his memories pressing down on him like a physical force. The moment we realized we had awakened something beyond our comprehension came during the siege of New Geneva, Kethmal said, his voice growing heavier with each word. By this point, the war had been raging for almost 2 years. Both sides had taken heavy losses, but the Galactic Council was confident that victory was within reach. He paused, staring into his drink, as if searching for answers in its depths. New Geneva was humanity's crown jewel, their most advanced colony world, home to nearly 10 million civilians. It was also their primary industrial center, producing everything from medical supplies to advanced technology. If we could take New Geneva, we could cripple the human war effort. Thyrix, who had been unusually subdued since the previous stories, leaned forward. "How big was the attacking force?" "Everything we had," Kethmal replied grimly. 300 warships, including 5 super dreadnoughts and 12 orbital bombardment platforms. 500,000 ground troops from 6 different species, supported by atmospheric fighters, hover tanks, and enough firepower to level a continent. It was the largest military operation in galactic history. The old veteran's laugh was bitter. Command was so confident of victory that they started planning the victory celebration before the battle even began. Some of the junior officers were already discussing what they would do with their shore leave after the war ended. He stood up slowly, his movements stiff with age and old wounds. I had been promoted to senior tactical officer by then, serving aboard the flagship Galactic Dominion. Admiral Zexthor himself was commanding the operation. The plan was simple: surround the planet, demand surrender, and if they refused, bombard them into submission. Kethmal began pacing around the table, his forearms gesturing as he recreated the tactical situation. The human commander was a woman named Song Ha-un. Our intelligence files showed she was a former terraforming engineer who had been pressed into military service. No formal combat training, no experience commanding large-scale operations. On paper, she looked like exactly the kind of amateur we could easily defeat. But she had already proven that human amateurs could be more dangerous than our best professionals, added Zist, his large black eyes reflecting the amber light. Exactly, Kethmal confirmed. So Admiral Zexthor was taking no chances. We positioned our fleet in a perfect blockade formation, with overlapping fields of fire, covering every possible escape route. The orbital bombardment platforms were calibrated to reduce the planet's major cities to rubble within hours. The veteran sat back down, his expression growing more troubled. We transmitted the standard ultimatum: surrender unconditionally within 24 hours or face total annihilation. No negotiations, no mercy, no quarter given. We expected them to fold immediately when they saw the size of our force. "But they didn't," whispered one of the younger aliens. Song Ha-un's response was unexpected, Kethmal continued. She invited Admiral Zexthor to a face-to-face meeting on the planet's surface, said she wanted to discuss terms in person, away from the cold vacuum of space. Most of our senior staff thought it was a trap, but the Admiral was curious. The old veteran's eyes took on that distant look again, as if he was seeing events from decades past. Zexthor took a full security detail down to the planet, 200 elite guards, portable shields, heavy weapons, the works. He was expecting either an ambush or a formal surrender ceremony. What he got instead was a tour of the city. The cantina was so quiet now that several patrons were holding their breath. Kethamal's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing everyone to lean in closer. Song Ha-yun met them at the landing pad, wearing a simple civilian dress, no weapons, no guards. She looked like someone's grandmother, not a military commander. But there was something in her eyes that made even our toughest soldiers nervous. He paused to take a sip of his drink, his hands steadier now as he lost himself in the memory. She showed them everything: their hospitals, filled with wounded civilians from previous raids, their schools, where children were still attending, classes despite the massive fleet overhead, their parks where families were having picnics as if nothing unusual was happening. The Admiral kept asking when they would discuss surrender terms, but Song Ha-yun just smiled and kept walking. She brought them to the city's central square, where thousands of humans had gathered. Not soldiers or officials, just ordinary people. Teachers, shopkeepers, factory workers, children, elderly couples holding hands. Kethamal's voice grew even quieter. That's when she asked the question that changed everything. She looked Admiral Zexthor in the eye and said, "What would you do if someone came to your world and demanded you kneel? What would you do if they threatened your children, your way of life, your very existence?" The silence that followed was so complete that the hum of the station's life support system seemed loud by comparison. The Admiral tried to explain that resistance was futile, that they were facing impossible odds, that surrender was the only logical choice. But Song Ha-yun just smiled and said, "We already know what we'll do. The question is, are you prepared for the cost of finding out?" Thyrix's mandibles clicked nervously. What did she mean? That night, Admiral Zexthor ordered the bombardment to begin, Kethamal continued. But the humans had spent months preparing for this moment. They had turned their entire city into a fortress. Every building was a bunker, every street a killing field, every sewer tunnel a defensive position. The veteran stood up again, his movements more animated as he relived the battle. Our orbital bombardment platforms opened fire at dawn, massive energy beams that should have vaporized entire city blocks. But instead of the expected destruction, the beams scattered harmlessly off some kind of shield network the humans had built into the city's infrastructure. A shield network, asked one of the listeners. They had turned every building's power system into part of a massive defensive grid, Kethamal explained. Civilian power plants, vehicle batteries, even children's toys, all connected in a network that could absorb and redirect our bombardment energy. It was improvised, inefficient, and completely insane. It was also brilliant. He sat back down, his expression growing darker. When the bombardment failed, Admiral Zexthor ordered the ground assault. 500,000 troops dropped from orbit, supported by atmospheric fighters and heavy armor. It should have been over in hours. The human defenders were led by a man named Yang Minho, a former construction worker who had learned military tactics by watching old battle recordings. He didn't fight like a trained soldier. He fought like someone who knew every pipe, every wire, every structural weakness in the city he had helped build. Kethamal's voice grew more intense. They didn't just fight building to building. They fought room to room, floor to floor, sometimes wall to wall. When we thought we had cleared a section, they would emerge from hidden tunnels and attack our rear positions. They had turned urban warfare into an art form. "How long did the battle last?" whispered Zist. 7 days, Kethamal replied. 7 days of the most brutal, desperate fighting the galaxy had ever seen. But it was what happened on the 3rd day that truly broke our spirit. The old veteran's voice cracked slightly as he continued. A human medic named Yun Su-jin was treating wounded soldiers in a bombed-out hospital, both human and alien wounded. She had turned the basement into a makeshift medical center, saving lives regardless of species or allegiance. When our forces surrounded the building, she could have surrendered. Her patients were too wounded to fight, her supplies were almost gone, and she was completely outnumbered. Instead, she activated a distress beacon. Kethamal's hands were shaking again as he reached for his glass. What happened next defied every tactical manual in the galaxy. Human civilians, teachers, shopkeepers, mechanics, children, barely old, enough to hold weapons, began converging on the hospital, not to surrender or evacuate, but to fight. They had heard that their medic was in danger, and they came running. Grandmothers with hunting rifles, teenagers with improvised explosives, middle-aged office workers wielding kitchen knives. They poured out of every building, every tunnel, every hiding place in the city. The veteran's voice grew stronger as he continued. I watched from the command center as wave after wave of civilians threw themselves at our positions. They weren't trained soldiers. They were ordinary people who had decided that some things were worth dying for, and they fought with a fury that made our best warriors look like children. The hospital became a symbol, Kethmal said, his eyes reflecting the pain of old memories. Every human in the city knew that Yun Su-jin was saving lives, treating friend and enemy alike, and they were willing to sacrifice everything to protect her. He finished his drink in one gulp and set the glass down with a sharp clink. That's when we realized we weren't just fighting an army or even a species. We were fighting an idea, the idea that some principles are worth more than life itself. The cantina remained silent as the weight of his words settled over the crowd. Finally, Therix found his voice. What happened to the medic? Kethmal's smile was sad but genuine. She survived, so did most of her patients, but the cost of protecting that one hospital was higher than anyone could have imagined. The weight of the previous battles hung heavy in the air as Kethmal prepared to tell the final chapter of his story. His forearms moved with less coordination now, the memories clearly taking their toll on the old veteran. Several more patrons had quietly gathered around their table, drawn by the power of his words. The final battle lasted 7 days, Kethmal said, his voice now barely above a whisper. 7 days of the most brutal, desperate fighting the galaxy had ever witnessed. What started as a simple planetary siege had become something else entirely, a test of wills that would determine the fate of 2 civilizations. He paused, running one scarred hand along the table's surface. By the 4th day, our casualties were staggering. We had lost over 100,000 troops, dozens of ships, and still the humans kept fighting. Every street corner was a fortress, every building a death trap. They had turned their own city into a weapon against us. The cantina was so quiet that the distant hum of the space station's engines could be heard through the walls. Kethmal's voice carried the weight of decades-old pain. The humans fought with everything they had, military weapons when they could get them, improvised explosives made from household chemicals, kitchen knives and farming tools when their ammunition ran out. I saw a human grandmother throw boiling water at our assault troops, then pick up a fallen soldier's rifle and keep fighting. His crystalline eyes reflected the amber lights like fractured mirrors. On the 6th day, I watched a group of human children, none of them older than 12, coordinate an ambush that destroyed 3 of our armored vehicles. They had been learning warfare from their parents, turning their playground games into military tactics. Therix shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The young mantoid had been completely silent since the story began, his earlier arrogance replaced by growing horror. Admiral Zexthor was becoming desperate, Kethmal continued. The losses were mounting and reports were coming in of human reinforcements mobilizing across the galaxy. Every day we spent on New Geneva was another day for humanity to prepare their defenses elsewhere. The old veteran stood up slowly, his movements stiff with age and old injuries. That's when the Admiral made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered the use of chemical weapons, gas that would flood the underground tunnels and force the humans to surrender or suffocate. A collective gasp went up from the younger aliens. Chemical weapons were banned by every civilized species in the galaxy. The gas deployment began at dawn on the 7th day, Kethmal said, his voice heavy with shame. We watched from orbit as the deadly clouds spread through the city's tunnel systems. For a few hours the resistance seemed to weaken. We thought we had finally broken them. He sat back down heavily, his forearms trembling. But then, something happened that still gives me nightmares. The humans began emerging from their tunnels, but they weren't surrendering. They were wearing improvised gas masks made from clothing and water bottles, and they were angrier than we had ever seen them. Yang Minho led the counterattack personally. He had been poisoned by the gas, but refused medical treatment until the battle was over. I watched him charge our positions with a construction tool in one hand and a rifle in the other, his face covered by a makeshift mask that was already stained with his own blood. The veteran's voice cracked as he continued. The fighting that day was beyond savage. Both sides had abandoned all pretense of civilized warfare, but it was the humans who showed us what true determination looked like. They fought with their bare hands when their weapons failed, used their own bodies as shields to protect their wounded, and never, ever gave up. Kethmal stared into his empty glass, his reflection distorted by the curved surface. On the morning of the 8th day, something unprecedented happened. The humans raised a white flag, but not over the government buildings or military installations, over their hospital. The silence in the cantina was so complete that several patrons were holding their breath. Even the background noise of the space station seemed muted. They were surrendering to protect their wounded, Kethmal explained. Both human and alien wounded. The hospital had become a sanctuary where Yoon Soo-jin and her team were treating anyone who needed help, regardless of which side they had been fighting for. He looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. Song Ha-yoon met with Admiral Zexthor one final time. She was wounded, exhausted, her clothes torn and stained with blood, but her spirit remained unbroken. She looked like she had been through hell, but she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had never compromised her principles. "What did she say?" whispered Zist, his large black eyes wide with anticipation. "She made him an offer that would end the war once and for all," Kethamal replied. "She offered to show him the true strength of humanity, not their weapons, not their tactics, but their values." The old veteran's voice grew stronger as he continued. "She took Admiral Zexthor to the hospital where Yoon Soo-jin had been working around the clock for 7 days. The building was barely standing, its walls cracked by explosions, its windows blown out by the fighting. But inside, something miraculous was happening. The human medic wasn't just treating human wounded, she had been saving everyone who came through her doors. Injured Zephyrians, wounded Mantoids, even captured Velkari, all receiving the same care, the same attention, the same chance at survival as human patients." Kethamal's voice cracked as he reached the climax of his story. Admiral Zexthor walked through that makeshift hospital, seeing his own soldiers being treated by the same people he had been trying to kill. And then he found something that changed everything. What did he find? The question came from several voices at once. "His own nephew," Kethmal said, his voice barely audible. "A young pilot named Crixtal, barely out of flight school. The boy had been shot down on the first day of the battle, and we had assumed he was dead. But there he was, alive and recovering, being treated by human medics who had risked their own lives to save him." The veteran's forearms trembled as he continued. Crixtal told his uncle how the humans had found him in the wreckage of his fighter, badly injured and barely conscious. They could have let him die, could have used him as a bargaining chip, could have simply ignored him. Instead, they had carried him through active combat zones to get him medical attention. Yoon Soo-jin herself had operated on him, using her limited supplies to save the life of someone who had been trying to kill her people just hours before. She had worked for 6 hours straight to repair his injuries, then stayed by his bedside to make sure he recovered. Kethamal's laugh was hollow, but there was something else in it now, a trace of admiration. That's when Admiral Zexthor understood what we were really fighting. Not just soldiers or warriors, but something far more dangerous. Beings who fought, not just for victory, but for principles that transcended species, boundaries, even their own survival. The old veteran stood up again, his movement steadier now. The Admiral asked Song Ha-yoon why they had saved his nephew, why they had risked so much for someone who was technically their enemy. Her answer was simple. Because it was the right thing to do. Right there in that bombed-out hospital, surrounded by the wounded and dying of both sides, Admiral Zexthor made the decision that would end the war. He ordered an immediate ceasefire and opened formal peace negotiations. Kethamal's voice grew stronger as he reached the conclusion. The war ended that day, not because we defeated the humans, but because we realized we had been fighting something we couldn't comprehend, a species that would rather die than compromise their values. He looked around the cantina, his crystalline eyes reflecting decades of hard-won wisdom. The human casualties were enormous. Park Hyun-woo died at Kepler Station, ramming his broken ship into our flagship. Lee So-young sacrificed herself to blind our fleet. Choi Woo-jin sang as he flew into certain death. Jang Min-ho fought until the gas poisoning finally claimed him. Song Ha-yun survived the war, but died 2 years later from injuries sustained during the siege. But their sacrifice taught the galaxy a lesson we'll never forget, he continued. The humans didn't just defeat our fleets, they defeated the idea that might makes right. They showed us that some things are worth dying for, and that true strength comes not from the ability to destroy, but from the courage to protect. Kethmel placed a few credits on the table and began walking toward the exit. His movements were slow but dignified, carrying the weight of his memories like a badge of honor. "Remember this, young ones," he said, pausing at the cantina's entrance. "The day you think you understand humans is the day you've underestimated them. They are not the strongest species in the galaxy, not the fastest, not the most advanced, but they are something far more dangerous. They are the most determined." He looked back at the table of young recruits, his expression serious. And that determination, that refusal to surrender their principles no matter the cost, is what makes them the most feared and respected species in the galaxy today. As the veteran disappeared into the crowded corridors of Nexus Prime, the cantina slowly began to return to its normal buzz of conversation. But the young recruits remained silent, each lost in their own thoughts about the price of war and the true meaning of courage. Thyrex finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never knew." "None of us did," replied Zist quietly. "Until it was too late." The ambient noise of the cantina gradually returned to normal, but the impact of Kethmal's story would stay with his listeners for the rest of their lives. They had come expecting tales of easy victories and alien weakness. Instead, they had learned about the most dangerous force in the galaxy, not superior weapons or advanced technology, but the unbreakable human spirit. The end.